Most of us know Alice in Wonderland as the trippy fever dream of talking rabbits, vanishing cats, and homicidal queens. But a lot of people forget that the book's author, Lewis Carroll, didn't stop there. In 1871, just a few years after finding success in Wonderland, he wrote a sequel, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. And while this story isn't talked about quite as much as the original, I assure you it is every bit as entertaining and twice as strange. Actually, I don't want to quantify the strangeness. I was just referencing a quote from the book. This time, Alice doesn't fall down a rabbit hole, but climbs through a mirror, and awaiting her on the other side is not the same Wonderland we came to know in the last book, but a strange, apparently new world that runs on a giant chessboard. But just like Wonderland, there is way more to this story than whimsy. Carroll packed it with parodies of Victorian society, logic puzzles, and some darker undertones that most readers miss. And today, I'm uncovering all of it, so follow me through the looking glass as we dive into its messed up origins. In true Carrollian fashion, the opening scene of Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There is a direct contrast to the introduction of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. You'll remember that the previous story opens on a warm summer day, and while Alice's sister is busy reading a book without pictures, Alice dozes off, triggering the appearance of the White Rabbit. While Through the Looking Glass takes place on a snowy afternoon, and Alice is taking shelter from the cold in her family's drawing room. While sitting in a big comfy chair, she lectures one of her cat Dinah's two kittens for causing trouble and threatens to put him in the looking glass house, i.e. the mirror, which she goes on to describe as being the same as their house, but everything is reflected the other way. Then Alice gets out of the chair, climbs onto the mantle, and pretends that she can travel through the mirror, only to discover that she actually can. As she pushes through the mirror, it turns into a silvery mist, and as she climbs through, she finds herself back in the drawing room. Only everything is reversed, just as she described before. She was now in the looking glass house, and things were a lot more interesting here than at home. Pictures on the wall were engaged in lively conversation, while the chess pieces searched the room frantically for the White Queen's daughter, Lily. Now, Alice could see plain as day that Lily was on the table, so she tried to help the king and queen by placing them on the table. But evidently, she didn't anticipate the toll that changing elevation so quickly would take on the royals, because when she set them down, they were both wide-eyed and out of breath. Traumatized, for lack of a better term. Her arrival at the Looking Glass house in Bobbin's movie goes down quite a bit different. For starters, Alice shrinks down to about a 50th of her size. Her encounter with the chess pieces is just as chaotic, but it incorporates Humpty-Dumpty, whom she knocks off the table. Then, all the king's horses and men from the chessboard try to put him together again. Alice does encounter Humpty-Dumpty in the book as well, but it's not until she's about halfway across the chessboard, and their interaction is way different, so stick around if you want to hear about it. Back to book Alice, sitting on the same table that she had just put the chess pieces on, was a book containing what became one of Carroll's most iconic poems, The Jabberwocky. Now remember that everything on this side of the mirror is reversed, so when Alice opened up the book, the text looked like this. But when she held it up to the mirror, she was able to read it without issue. I've debated on how much of this poem I should include here because it's a whole ass wall of text, and I don't want us to get too sidetracked from the main story, especially when the book has so many poems and they all contain this much nonsense. So I'm just gonna give you the gist. Or you could just listen to the Hatter recite parts of it in the Burton movie, but it's probably not worth subjecting yourself to that.
The Jabberwock with eyes of flame, jaws that bite and claws that catch. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, on the frumious Bandersnatch.
The Jabberwocky poem is basically about the death of the Jabberwocky and details how the poem's hero chops its head off with a Vorpal sword, the same fate that it ultimately succumbs to in Burton's adaptation. Linda Wolverton turned the plot of Alice in Wonderland from a nonsensical adventure to your prototypical hero's journey, based around the Jabberwocky poem. But fans of the poem might be surprised to hear that at one point, Carol actually considered cutting out the iconic illustration that accompanies it, out of concern that it would terrify his young readers. But after getting the okay from a couple dozen mommies, he committed to keeping it. We'll talk more about the poem's meaning when we get to chapter 6, because Humpty-Dumpty is going to enlighten us on where some of the more obscure terminology came from. As for right now, Alice's adventure is only just beginning. She leaves the comfort of the drawing room, floats down the stairs, and right out the front door of the Looking-Glass house. Now, in my breakdown of Alice's first adventure, I talked about how many aspects of this book were directly influenced by trends and social customs from Victorian society. Like Alice reciting poetry on demand came from the real expectations that were placed on children living in that society, especially girls, to be articulate, have poise, and to be mentally acute. While writing this episode, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of nonsensical behaviors Lewis Carroll would have incorporated if he lived in our society, especially with our technology. What kind of Wonderland would Alice have found if she fell asleep at the computer instead of sitting outside and touching grass like kids did in the olden days? And how would Carroll himself have used modern technology to tell new stories? It's impossible to say for sure, but I am confident in saying that if he was going to build a website, he would have used our sponsor, Squarespace. Because why wouldn't you use Squarespace? At this point, they basically build your website for you. Thanks to their new AI tools like Design Intelligence, your business, side hustle, or passion project can have a dedicated website in minutes. You just gotta tell it what kind of site you need, what kind of aesthetic you're going for, and Design Intelligence does the rest. Of course, if you want to fine-tune things, you always can. And the Fluid engine makes that real easy, because making tweaks is as simple as dragging and dropping. None of that coding nonsense is required. Whether you're trying to sell some homemade goods, share your art with the world in a custom portfolio, or schedule appointments, you can do it with Squarespace. Maybe best of all though is that you can try them out totally free. Just go to squarespace.com/Jon Solo or hit the link in the description. Then when you realize you love it, use code Jon Solo to get 10% off your first purchase. And so we arrive at the first Looking-Glass encounter to be included in the animated adaptation, the Garden of Live Flowers, and Disney followed the original story almost exactly. Both heroines enter the garden and are surprised when the flowers start speaking to them, and the flowers respond that they only talk when there's someone worth talking to. Then they start critiquing Alice's appearance, commenting on her droopy petals, skinny stems, and her total lack of fragrance. She'll never bring her family honor. Wait, wrong movie. In the film, Alice defends herself by declaring that she isn't a flower, but rather genus humanus Alice, only that makes the flowers more critical, because now they think she's a weed. In the book, Alice gets tired of their insults and threatens to pick them, which shuts them up real quick. She threatens to pick them in the movie as well, but they don't take her seriously and respond by dumping water on her, flushing her away to the next encounter. In the book, though, their convo continues, and they tell her about the Red Queen, who thankfully is not the same as the Queen of Hearts, but she can be just as temperamental. When Lewis Carroll described his envisioning of the character in his article Alice on the Stage, he says he pictured her as a fury, but of another type. Her passion must be cold and calm. She must be formal and strict, yet not unkindly, pedantic to the 10th degree. The concentrated essence of all governesses. And I think that's the perfect way of describing her, because when Alice first encounters her, she tells the Queen that she's lost her way, and the Queen responds not by offering guidance, but by saying that all ways belong to her.
Always here are my ways.
Then, when Alice says she's trying to get to the top of that nearby hill, the Queen replies that compared to the hills that she's seen, that one is a valley. Which again is not helpful. Eventually, Alice does make it to the top of the hill though, and while surveying the landscape, she notices it looks exactly like a chessboard, complete with hedges and babbling brooks to divvy up the territory. Then Alice says that she'd like to play chess and wouldn't mind being a pawn, and the Red Queen makes it so, turning Alice into a pawn. The White Queen's pawn, for some reason. We don't have time to question the logic, or lack thereof, because the Queen then grabs Alice's hand and starts running. She runs so fast that Alice can barely keep up, and after 10 straight minutes of sprinting, they finally stop. only for Alice to realize they hadn't moved at all. It's here that we're treated to one of the story's most famous quotes. The Red Queen explains, "Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place," which is probably a play on the story being set inside a mirror where logic is reversed. But I think we can all agree that life itself feels that way sometimes. Now, another major difference with the live-action movies is they combined the characters of the Queen of Hearts and the Red Queen, and then made the White Queen her sister. The two's final battle also takes place on a chessboard, just like the book does. One of the more interesting and bizarre facts about this story is that Alice and the characters that she interacts with symbolize movement on a chessboard, and her journey ends with the checkmate of the Red King. But don't give it too much credit, because the game of chess that ensues is basically like two Wonderland characters are playing with little to no rules. Pieces make illegal moves, they have no self-preservation instincts, and they don't take turns properly. To put it another way, the checkmate itself is orthodox, but the journey to get there is not. You'll see for yourself as the story unfolds, because we made a 3D rendering of the game just for this episode. If that doesn't deserve a like and subscribe, I don't know what does. Now Alice is approaching the edge of the second square, meaning she's got 6 more to go. And boy, do those 6 squares contain some insanity. Speaking of insanity, if you're looking for a way to represent your love for the Alice in Wonderland series, but the current selection at Hot Topic isn't doing it for you, you could pick up one of our Mad Cat tees or hoodies. We are once again taking advantage of the public domain and paying tribute to the only Wonderland resident who understands just how mad he is. We also recently upgraded our entire hoodie lineup, so they have an even softer, cozier fit just in time for fall. So if you want to be comfy and a little bit creepy this spooky season, go to meremortals.store or hit the link in the description. So Chapter 3 does get referenced in both the live-action and animated movies, but understandably, they're quick little nods of acknowledgement as opposed to retellings of the entire chapter. You'll see what I mean in a minute, because the book's Alice jumps over one of the babbling brooks that separates the squares, and she was instantly transported onto a train, a rather unfriendly train at that. The train's ticket man was demanding that Alice hand over her ticket, and so was everybody else on the train. Now, we both know that Alice was not anticipating this train ride, so she doesn't have a ticket, which leads to a rain of insults and mockery from her fellow passengers. They say she doesn't know her name, the alphabet, and that she'll have to ride the train back as luggage since she hasn't bought a seat. Fortunately, Alice didn't have to deal with their snide remarks for very long, because the train makes a jump over the brook at the end of the third square, and while Alice is sailing through the air, the train and its passengers dissipate, and she's suddenly sitting under a tree. The only train passenger still with Alice is a little gnat that's been buzzing bad puns into her ear for the past 10 minutes, and the two discuss the unique bug species that populate the Looking Glass world. There's the rocking horsefly with a body made entirely of wood, the snap dragonfly with a body of plum pudding, wings of holly leaves, and a head made from a burning brandy-soaked raisin, also bread and butterflies. We get to see a few of these in the animated movie.
Curious butterflies.
You mean bread and butterflies?
And the Talkin' Flowers sing about some other creatures, like dog and caterpillars and copper centipedes. They get a nod of acknowledgement in Burton's movie as well, but it's a blink and you'll miss it reference when Alice first arrives in Wonderland. After her conversation with the gnat, the book's Alice enters the forest of things with no name, and the deeper into it that she walks, the more that she forgets, to the point where she has no idea where she's going or even what her name is. I think, although I could be wrong, that the animated film was referencing this bit with the scene in the Tolji Wood, a phrase that also comes from the Jabberwocky poem, by the way. Alice encounters more curious critters, not unlike the Looking Glass insects, until she gets so lost that the Cheshire Cat has to guide her to the Queen's gardens. Something rather different happens in the sequel, though. Alice just soldiers on alongside a fawn, who's also forgotten its identity until they make it far enough in that the fawn remembers that it's a deer and should probably be afraid of humans and runs away from Alice. The girl wouldn't be alone for long though, because further down the path, she could see two short little fatties. And no, I'm not talking about Gunther and Penny. Buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, because you're about to learn a whole lot about Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And honestly, I did not realize there was so much history behind these two. See, I always thought the Tweedles were completely original characters, but no. Alice in Wonderland's fame has just eclipsed the source material they came from, a nursery rhyme. I know that some of you are rolling your eyes at my ignorance, either because you know the rhyme or because there's a line in the book that literally says, "The words of the old song kept ringing through her head," with the lyrics right below it. But I don't know, maybe when I read this story the first time, I still thought the rhyme originated within the Alice canon. Regardless, the rhyme goes as follows. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking, what? But don't worry, I got the inside scoop. If you've seen my Nursery Rhymes Explained series, you'll know the majority of messed up origin stories for nursery rhymes are really just decades-old myths that either don't have any compelling evidence to back them up, or in some cases are verifiably false. What's cool about Tweedledum and Tweedledee, though, is we know exactly when the terms were invented, who invented them, and who they were meant to make fun of. Let's go back to the year 1720, a time when Johann Sebastian Bach was actively composing some of the most famous melodies the world will ever know, and Britain's coffee houses were bustling with activity and lively debates among their caffeine-fueled patrons. Also taking place at this time was a little artistic rivalry between two composers whose names I'll forget the moment I finish recording this episode, George Frederick Handel and Giovanni Bononcini. See? You're gonna forget them too. To put it simply, both Handel and Bononcini were hired to compose operas for the Royal Academy of Music Company, which King George I and a bunch of Richie Riches founded, so they had an endless supply of operas to watch. This is not to be confused with the Royal Academy of Music in London, which opened 100 years later and is still enriching students' lives with music to this day. But it has a scary elevator, and for that reason, Cole Wilson had to give it 1 star. What a shithole. Anyway, both of the aforementioned composers, Handel and Bononcini, were talented lads, and soon enough the Richie Riches started to argue among themselves about which composer they liked more. And I guess the feud became a pretty big deal, because in 1725, the English poet John Byrom wrote a rhyme satirizing the whole situation. Some say, compared to Bononcini, that Mynheer Handel's but a ninny. Others aver that he to Handel's scarcely fit to hold a candle. Strange all this difference should be twixt Tweedledum and Tweedledee.
What the fuck?
So that is the earliest known appearance of the Tweedledum and Tweedledee names in any printed media, and ipso facto, the potential real-life identities of the Tweedles. But it's obviously not the nursery rhyme that Alice was talking about. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes, one of the most trusted resources on said topic, that rhyme was not put into print until 80 years after Byrom, when the original Juvenile Library put out a collection called Original Ditties for the Nursery in 1806. We still don't have an author. The J. Harris listed on the cover is the book's publisher, but all of the rhymes included would have been in the public domain anyway. They also don't have any melodies, so there's no composer to give credit to. Now, just to be clear, it is totally possible that the children's rhyme about the battle and the rattle existed before John Byrom wrote his epigram about the composers, and that could be where he took the terms Tweedledee and Tweedledum from. But because the children's children's rhyme wasn't published until almost a century after his epigram, he was the first one to use them in a written work, and so he's officially credited as the creator of the terms. But while Lewis Carroll may have taken their name from the pre-existing rhyme, the peculiar way that illustrator Jon Tenniel depicts the Tweedles wearing schoolboy skeleton suits is completely original and unique to this story. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the first time the duo was ever illustrated, but I may have missed some obscure nursery rhyme collection with little illustrations like this one here has. Alice's encounter with the Tweedles in the book is actually reimagined pretty well in the movie, the animated one. The 2010 remake clearly had no idea what to do with them, and the extent of their role is summed up in this one scene that I am convinced writer Linda Wolverton included as a metaphor for her own struggles trying to utilize them in the plot.
Speak, boys. Amuse us. I love my fat boys. Now, get out.
She did find some clever ways to reference them in the sequel, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, since the animated Alice focuses on the story from the first book, she runs into the Tweedles while chasing after the White Rabbit. But in Through the Looking Glass, she's still on her way to the other side of the chessboard where she'll hopefully be turned from a pawn to a queen. Both versions of Alice notice how odd the little fat boys are right away, as well as the fact that they have their names stitched on their collars. Both Alices also mistake the Tweedles as statues because they're standing so still, a faux pas that they chastise her for before demonstrating how to properly greet someone. Then, when she reaches out to shake both their hands at the same time, out of fear of offending them by picking one over the other, the boys just start spinning around in circles while Alice sings "Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush." Once again, this is all reflected in the animated movie. But speaking of reflections, I noticed something really interesting about the Tweedles while reading the primary resource I used for this episode, the Annotated Alice. One of the annotations points out that Dum and Dee are not just identical, they mirror each other and are known as enantiomorphs. If you look at this illustration of them, you'll see that one has his right hand extended while the other has his left. And the same thing happens in the 1951 Alice, showing just how detail-oriented their artists used to be. After Dee and Dum finish their etiquette lesson, they start an absurdly long poem about a walrus and a carpenter. And normally I wouldn't want to get sidetracked, but screw it, we have time. It's actually a pretty funny story. And a little bit sad. Basically, a walrus and a carpenter are walking on the beach on a bright, sunshiny night, wishing that somebody would clean up all the sand. Then they convince a family of oysters, baby oysters mind you, to walk on the beach with them, which is apparently possible due to the single foot that oyster larvae have. After that, they eat the oysters, betraying the trust their new friends had placed in them and only feeling a little guilty about it when all was said and done. The poem is pointless and the ending is pretty messed up, but if you're crying big cartoony tears over the young oyster's fate, you'll be happy to know that in the stage play, they get revenge. The ghosts of the oysters come back and attack the walrus and carpenter in their sleep by stomping on their chest with their tiny little larva feet. Now, unlike the poem about the Tweedles, the walrus and the carpenter is a Lewis Carroll original, and while tempting, it's probably not worth it to comb through for any symbolism or hidden meaning. I say this because the Annotated Alice includes a letter from Carroll himself where he mentions telling illustrator Jon Tenniel that he could pick any partner for the walrus that he wanted as long as it had 3 syllables, like the word carpenter, and made for an interesting drawing. Some alternates he suggested were baronet and butterfly, but Tenniel went with carpenter in the end. Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson, was an eccentric weirdo whose personal life and niche interests always made their way into his written works. But as you can see, he didn't let them get in the way of telling an entertaining story that audiences would love. When his illustrator expressed concern over how he could draw a carpenter in an entertaining way, Carroll listened and said that he could replace it as long as it didn't mess with the poem's structure. Where another author might have said no, because their dad was a carpenter and he loved to eat oysters and was raised by walruses, allowing their personal attachment to sabotage their work. Of course, if you're confident in your vision, then you gotta stick to it and defend it where necessary, but make sure it really is the vision that you're defending and not your ego. Anyway, once the poem ends, we get a scene that's exclusive to the book. Dee and Dum take Alice to the Red King, who's sleeping nearby, probably referencing that kings in chess barely move, and they debate what he could be dreaming about. Dee and Dum are adamant that he's dreaming about Alice, but this opens up a whole can of worms and a wormhole, because Alice is dreaming about the king while the king dreams about Alice, who's dreaming about the king while the king dreams about Alice, who's dreaming about the king while he's dreaming about Alice, who dreams about him while he's dreaming about her, who's dreaming about him while he's dreaming about her. When Alice tries to walk away, Tweedledum grabs her by the wrist and points at the ground with a fear-stricken face. The new white rattle he just bought yesterday is broken, and Tweedledee is to blame. So they recruit Alice to help them suit up for a duel, just like in the nursery rhyme. Now, if you're watching this episode on YouTube or Spotify, then you can see the rattle in the illustration, and it's a little-known fact that Carol did not like this illustration. Do you want to know why? Pause the video to leave your guess in a comment, but the real answer is ... It's the wrong kind of rattle. John Tenniel drew what's called a watchman's rattle instead of a children's rattle. Nowadays, watchman's rattles are mostly used as noisemakers at parties, but apparently they were notoriously easy to break, which is why Tenniel went with this version for the broken rattle. I don't know why Carol didn't just request Tenniel change the rattle before it was published, but my guess is that it escaped his vision on the first pass and then he didn't notice it until it was too late. Well, Dee and Dum have gotta settle the score over this broken rattle situation, and after Alice armors up the Tweedles with pots, pans, cushions, and blankets, they're ready to fight. But they're immediately interrupted by a monstrous crow that scares them away. Again, just like the nursery rhyme. Interestingly, the book describes the crow as casting a giant shadow over the forest, and there's a theory that this is a reference to the Eclipse of Tales. After the Lydians and the Medes had been engaged in a grueling war for 5 years, one of their battles was interrupted by an eclipse, and the day suddenly turning to night convinced the leaders to end the conflict and negotiate peace. Personally, I think this similarity in themes is just a coincidence, but I'll take any excuse to talk mythology. Now, I will say that as pointless as the Tweedles were in the live-action movies, they did manage to reference the original rhyme in each one. In Burton's movie, they're picked up by a giant bird, but I think it's a jub-jub bird, which means this is also a reference to the Jabberwocky poem. And in Through the Looking Glass, we see the young Dee and Dum duel each other in the snow. They even break their weapons and start crying, which has gotta be a reference to the broken rattle situation. In the book though, Alice is just as scared of the bird as they are, so she runs deeper into the wood to escape it. She eventually finds a safe haven, but she can still feel the terrific wind from its flapping wings, and then she notices off in the distance, someone's shawl is blowing away. You see, unlike some people, Alice had all the makings of a varsity athlete, so she caught the shawl out of the air without a problem, and she quickly found its owner, the White Queen. The White Queen shows up in the live-action movies as well, but she has a very different personality than the one in the book, who Lewis Carroll described as fancy, gentle, stupid, fat, and pale, helpless as an infant, and with a slow, maundering, bewildered air about her, just suggesting imbecility, never quite passing into it. The movie's White Queen is a bit aloof, but she's definitely not an imbecile. She's also the Queen of Hearts' sister. In that universe, the Queen of Hearts and Red Queen are the same character, but that is thankfully not the case in the book. The book Alice's interaction with the White Queen is pretty funny. After she returns the shawl and fixes up the Queen's outfit, which was in all kinds of disarray, the Queen fills her in on some gossip. The King's messenger is in prison, although he won't actually commit the crime for another few weeks. Typical Looking Glass logic. What makes this bit of gossip particularly interesting, though, is that the accompanying illustration shows the Mad Hatter in jail looking very sad. And I could be wrong, but I think this inspired the Hatter's arrest in the 2010 adaptation. In the middle of talking to the White Queen, Alice bursts into tears over how lonely she is, and the Queen gives her a motivational speech that I think rivals the one that Yule gave to Junior in Cool Runnings. She says, "Oh, don't go on like that. Consider what a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider what o'clock it is. Consider anything. only don't cry. That's the way it's done. Nobody can do two things at once. Honestly, solid advice. Not really a long-term solution for handling those deep wounds that our childhoods all gave us, but if you gotta get yourself together on a moment's notice, a little distraction can go a long way. Now, the Queen also gives us a quote that fans of the live-action movie will recognize. She tells Alice that sometimes she believes 6 impossible things before breakfast. This quote is attributed to her dad in the movie, and she uses it as motivation in moments of self-doubt.
Sometimes, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Once again, the White Queen shawl blows away in the wind, and she has to chase after it. Apparently, her long, linear pursuits were a reference to how the Queen moves on a chessboard, which you can also see in our animations. Meanwhile, Alice jumps over a little brook and enters the 5th square. In true dream fashion, Alice continues to transport to new locations instantly, and now she's in a little shop that's run by a sheep. But she doesn't stay there for long. The sheep hands Alice a pair of knitting needles, which turn into oars, and suddenly they're sitting in a rowboat, giving us this chapter's title, Wool and Water. But again, they change locations quick. This time, they're back at the store, and Alice wants to buy an egg. Because who doesn't want an egg in trying times? But something weird happens when she goes to take it off the shelf. As she walks toward the egg, it gets further away. Another example of logic being reversed in the looking glass. Well, Alice catches on and starts walking backwards, away from the egg, and this seems to do the trick. Suddenly, she's no longer in the store. She's in the forest, and the egg is at the end of the path, beyond the babbling brook. Upon approaching the brook, Alice jumps over it and enters the 6th square, the domain of Humpty-Dumpty. So if you're a regular watcher of my content, you might have seen that earlier this year, I revisited Humpty-Dumpty's messed up origins. So it's inevitable that I'm going to tread on some of the same territory in this episode. That being said, this time around, I'm going to focus on Humpty-Dumpty and his role in the story as opposed to the nursery rhyme character, who may or may not have been inspired by a deformed king. If you want to learn about him, you could check that episode out. I'll put a link on screen and in the description if I remember. Now, when Alice first meets Humpty-Dumpty, he doesn't even have to introduce himself. She simply looks at him and says, "It can't be anybody else. I'm certain of it," as if his name were written all over his face. That's a pretty wild thing to say when you're describing someone with a name like Humpty-Dumpty, but when you see how Jon Solo drew him, it's hard to disagree. It's kind of like Gunther. I just looked at him and knew that had to be his name. It couldn't be anything else. Although I do call him Humpty-Dumpty when he's perched somewhere weird. I also feel like I have to mention this or I'm going to get a bunch of comments correcting me, but Tennille's illustration of Humpty-Dumpty as an egg, while the most famous and influential, was not the first of its kind. The annotated Alice mentions that in 1843, 22 years before the second Alice book was published, Samuel Edward Maberly, an Oxford alumni just like Carol, illustrated an accordion-style frieze that told Humpty's story as the pages were unfolded. It was titled The Pictorial Humpty-Dumpty. I also thought that was worth mentioning because Alice recognizing Humpty implies that she had seen him depicted somewhere before. Alice's interaction with Humpty kind of reminds me of her encounters with the Cheshire Cat and Caterpillar. The Eggman clearly fancies himself and tries to show off his superior intellect to Alice by asking her nonsensical riddles and using big fancy words incorrectly.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
But to be fair, he does say that when he uses a word, it means exactly what he intends it to mean, no more or less. With this in mind, Alice asks the master of linguistics to help her understand the Jabberwocky poem from earlier, so he defines some of the nonsense words of Carol's invention, like mimsy and borogrove. Here's a list of those definitions for those who are really curious, but there's no guarantee that Humpty's actually right about any of these. Plus, there are a few words like vorpal sword that Carol himself even admits he doesn't know where they came from. In other words, he pulled them out of the deep, dark recesses of his ass. After the egg's pedantic and questionably accurate explanation of the Jabberwocky, he starts spouting off a different ditty. This one is about a time where he wanted to eat some fish, but the fish would not come willingly, so he tried to break down their door. Sadly, we don't get to hear the end though, because Humpty Dumpty ends the poem on a dime and says goodbye before continuing to quietly sit on the wall and disregard Alice's existence. She's a little irritated by this confusing conclusion and storms off into the forest. But not long after, she hears a loud crash, and there's reason to believe it was the sound of Humpty Dumpty's great fall. The reason I believe that is because at the very next moment, Alice sees all the king's horses and men marching through the woods in Humpty's direction, although they aren't very good marchers. Both the men and horses are constantly tripping over each other. Humpty Dumpty unfortunately does not show up in the animated adaptation, but he does make a quick little cameo after the live-action Alice goes through the looking glass. While walking across the chessboard, which is no doubt a reference to the original story, she startles him and he falls to the floor. Then, all the king's horses and men show up to try and help, just like the poem and the story. But Book Alice wants to escape the chaotic scene of the knights helping Humpty, so she leaves the forest and encounters the White King, whose other messenger, the March Hare, delivers a special message. After giving the king a ham sandwich, he proceeds to scream in his ear that the lion and the unicorn are fighting for the crown again. Then, all three of them take off running, hoping to witness the fight before it's over. This is another example of Carol incorporating a nursery rhyme into the story. This one, as you'd expect, is called The Lion and the Unicorn, and the lyrics go, "The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown, the lion beat the unicorn all around the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown, some gave them plum cake and drummed them out of town." Now to those wondering what kind of conflict a lion and unicorn might have with each other, this one goes way far back and gets political. For the unicorn is Scotland's national animal, while the lion is England's, and their poetic pugilism may be a metaphor for the many wars the two countries have fought against each other. I'll be honest, I am not sure what the bread and cake are supposed to represent, if anything, so that could actually be evidence that the rhyme has nothing to do with their wars. Either way, the Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes suggests that the rhyme was popularized in the 17th century with the union of Scotland and England, and the resulting new British coat of arms featuring the Scottish unicorn and the British lion. Luckily, this fight doesn't end up as bloody as the War for Scottish Independence or the Battle of Wooing, but the unicorn is ultimately declared the victor and demands some of the aforementioned plum cake from the king. There's also a funny moment where the unicorn first sees Alice and is immediately disgusted at the sight of a child, which she always imagined as fabulous monsters. Surprisingly, Alice isn't offended by this characterization though, because she always thought of unicorns the same way, and in the end, both she and the unicorn agree to believe in each other now that they've seen each other. After this exchange, the lion comes over and starts playing 20 questions with Alice, asking her if she's an animal, a vegetable, or a mineral. But they don't get too deep into this because then he tells her to hand out the plum cakes. As she's serving up snacks to her new friends, they start to argue over who's getting more, when suddenly the sound of drums rings through the air and startles Alice so much that she runs away and jumps over the next brook, moving to the 7th square. It turns out that Alice was justified in being afraid, because almost immediately after entering the 7th square, the Red Knight shows up and declares her his prisoner. Lucky for Alice, the White Knight appears in the nick of time and the two battle. In true Carolian fashion, it's a ridiculous battle where the two use clubs to knock each other off their horses over and over again. I'd imagine it was an entertaining spectacle, but eventually the Red Knight decides this prisoner just ain't worth it and rides off. Now Alice is left alone with the White Knight, who some Carolians theorize represented Lewis Carroll himself due to their similarities. From the way the character is described with his mild blue eyes to his fascination with unusual and impractical inventions, like anklets that protect his horse's feet from shark bites. Additionally, the White Knight is uncharacteristically kind to Alice compared to the other Wonderland residents. He does pull on her hair multiple times to stop himself from falling off his horse, which doesn't really work, but he doesn't boss her around or call her names, and I don't doubt that Carroll would want his proxy to be nice to Alice. Next, the knight serenades Alice, and this is where it gets real strange, because Carroll wrote a paragraph where it sounds like Alice is kinda crushing on the knight. Tell me what you think. Of all the strange things that Alice saw in her journey through the looking glass, this was the one that she always remembered most clearly. Years afterwards, she could still bring the whole scene back again, as if it had been only yesterday. The mild blue eyes and kindly smile of the knight, the setting sun gleaming through his hair and shining on his armor in a blaze of light that quite dazzled her. I don't know, there's obviously nothing explicit about it, but it's just weird vibes. Alice meets a lot of Wonderland and Looking Glass characters, but for some reason the knight, the potential Carroll stand-in, is the only one that she has this deeply appreciative monologue for. I wonder if this is how Carroll hoped Alice would remember him when she looked back on her childhood, as a literal knight in shining armor with dazzling eyes, luscious hair, and a beautiful singing voice. But it doesn't end there. After the knight escorts Alice to the edge of the wood, he turns to leave her and asks that she stand there and wave a handkerchief until he's out of sight. You know, like a fair maiden would do for a knight that she was in love with before he rode off to war. Well, she doesn't pick up on any creepy vibe, so she happily obliges, and she stands there waving as the knight rides off on his horse, continuing to fall every few steps. Now, normally I would pivot to the next chapter at this point, but I actually have a deleted scene that I think some of you will appreciate. The incident is known as the Wasp in a Wig, and it's pretty famous among Lewis Carroll's fan base. I'm not going to bother going into too much detail because there's a reason that Carroll took this one out. Granted, he didn't actually give us one, but in my opinion, it's really not that entertaining and doesn't add that much value. Basically, there's just a sad wasp leaning against a tree and feeling sorry for himself because he's in an ugly, ill-fitting wig. Alice tries to make him feel better by reading him the newspaper and finding a more comfortable spot for him to sit, but he continues being rude to her until she gets sick of him and walks away. That's it. That's the whole thing. And like the rest of the story, we have no idea what it means. Was Carroll making fun of the 17th and 18th century fashion trends of wearing wigs? Was this an inside joke about a local tradesman that both he and Alice knew who wore an unkempt wig like the Wasp? Sadly, we'll never know for sure, but after Alice gets fed up with him, she walks back up to the babbling brook and jumps over it. When Alice lands on the 8th and final square, she ends up in a flower bed and realizes there's an extravagant golden crown on her head. Also, on her left and right side are the Red Queen and the White Queen, who immediately start lecturing her that she should only speak when spoken to, only tell the truth, to think before she speaks, and to write it down afterwards. The queens are very demanding and judgmental. They grill Alice on her math skills, on her phonics knowledge. They grill her on how bread is made, which is not on a grill, whether flowers are picked in the garden or the hedge, and what's the cause of lightning. I'm pretty sure we talked about this in my original Alice in Wonderland episode, and I might have actually said it earlier, but I don't know, I've been here a while. But the Queen's Pop Quiz and all the times that Alice has been asked to recite poetry were inspired by a real practice in Victorian times where children were trained in party pieces, little performances they could give to entertain the adults in their lives and show off their intelligence, memorization skills, poise, etc. This practice hasn't completely died out in the West though. Anyone with kids in their lives can tell you those little shits love to show off, and so do their parents. But their highlight reels aren't limited to reciting poetry or spouting off fun facts. Some kids play instruments, some do kickflips, and others Fortnite dance. But we don't need those kids.
Send him 2-3 years Dagestan and forget.
Anyway, all this back and forth wears out the red and white queens, who promptly fall asleep in Alice's lap. And unfortunately for Alice, they are heavy as hell. Luckily though, this is a dream, and again, she's instantly transported somewhere else, in front of an ornate, arched doorway with the words Queen Alice written above it. Then a frog kicks open the door for her. On the other side is an extravagant banquet with 50 guests of all kinds, including animals and flowers, and the queens have apparently woken up as well. Alice doesn't actually get to eat at this banquet though, because the queens keep introducing her to the food before she can eat it, and then swapping it out with something new. Eventually, Alice is asked to give a toast, but that too is interrupted before she can even start. The White Queen grabs her by the hair and says, "Take care of yourself, something's going to happen." And happen it did. The scene was pure chaos. Candles grew as tall as the ceiling, the bottles started flying around the room using little plates as wings and forks for their legs. The White Queen and leg of mutton had switched places, so now she was sinking into a bowl of soup. Other guests were lying with their faces down in their food, and eventually Alice hit her breaking point. While shouting that she can't stand this any longer, she grabs the tablecloth with both hands and yanks it off the table, sending everything crashing to the floor. Now that Alice has taken control of the situation, she's ready to lash out at the Red Queen. Only when she turns to yell at her, she finds the queen has shrunken down to the size of a kitten and is running around in circles. Alice picks up the Red Queen and shakes her back and forth with all her might, and strangely, the queen didn't resist at all. But she did seem to transform. Her eyes became green, and her bod became fatter and softer and rounder, until the truth was revealed. The Red Queen was the Black Kitten. When Alice realizes what just happened, she gets a little bit frustrated and starts scolding the black cat for waking her up from her dream with her loud purring. And I can't help but point out how, now that we're back in the real world, Alice is the unruly tyrant and scolder once again. Maybe that's why the queens were so critical of her. They were just giving her a taste of her own medicine. Following that line of thought, Alice also notices that the white kitten is still being cleaned by its mother. So maybe that's why the White Queen was so disheveled and untidy when Alice met her in the dream. And maybe Dinah turned into Humpty-Dumpty. Carol does not point out all the connections though. In fact, before the story ends, he actually reminds us that we still don't know whether the Red King was dreaming of Alice, or if she was dreaming of him, or if he was dreaming of her while she was dreaming. No, I'm kidding. And instead of giving us a satisfying answer, he ends Alice's adventure with a poem about the day that started it all. I don't want to recite the entire thing to you because I'm not a little girl in Victorian times, but I gotta draw your attention to the fact that the first letter of each line spells out Alice Little's full name, as well as the first 6 lines. A boat beneath a sunny sky lingered onward dreamily in an evening of July. Children 3 that nestled near, eager eye and willing ear, pleased a simple tale to hear. If you think it sounds like Carol is recalling a fond memory, you're right, because the July evening the poem references was the day that Carol took Alice Little and her 2 sisters on a boating expedition up the River Thames, and first told them the story of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. There's no way that he could have anticipated the influence that humble little story would have on the world. that it would find its way into nearly every facet of culture. From stage plays to comic books to video games, the world refuses to let her adventures end, and as she tumbles through time, she continues to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reborn for new generations. What started as a simple tale told to 3 children on a summer afternoon has become one of the most influential and enduring pieces of storytelling in human history. A looking glass that reflects our own curiosity, our fears, our humor, and our desire to make sense of a world that often feels just as nonsensical as Wonderland. And maybe that's the real magic of Alice's adventures, not the fantastic creatures or impossible logic, but it's a reminder that human imagination has no limits. That a story spun for some kids in a rowboat could ripple outward for more than 150 years and still inspire wonder today. So be on the lookout for your white rabbit, and once you catch sight of it, you follow it wherever it goes, because there is no telling where the rabbit hole will take you, but chances are, it's where you're meant to be.